You forget what you want to remember, and you remember what you want to forget. This line from Cormac McCarthy's The Road comes early on in the book, and I think it says a lot about history and life and identity. Where do stories come from? What is the value of a story? How do we choose what we remember and what we forget? We often talk about the value of not forgetting and remembering our past, but we rarely think about being careful about what we look at and what we pay attention to because we don't know what we won't be able to forget. I think you could argue over the course of thousands of years that for humanity, the story is all we are. And so we should be careful what that story becomes. And in Cormac McCarthy's book, The Road, the story of humanity has ended terribly. At a basic level, The Road is the story of a dad and his son living in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and they're on a journey together. They're traveling south along the road to the coast where they are looking to find warmth and survival and maybe even things like hope and goodness. Obviously, living in this post-apocalyptic environment, they're both weak and run down, and we learn early on in the book that the dad is also sick. Coughing fits, coughing up blood, this type of thing. And as the reader, we understand pretty quickly that the dad probably isn't going to make it all the way through this journey. And that's essentially the plot of The Road. Obviously, we're going to go into more detail about step by step what happens along their journey and what it means, but it's really just the bond between the father and the son and the obstacles that they overcome and sort of the question of human nature. What happens when you strip humanity down to the roots and you take away everything? What are we at our base? It's worth pointing out that in this book, humanity is completely stripped down to the base. The atmosphere and the environment that Cormac McCarthy creates in this post-apocalyptic world is completely hopeless. This is the most bare and dead and cold and barren and disgusting world that you could possibly think of. Throughout the book, you are, as the reader, constantly wondering what happened to get us to this. A world where everything is gray, the sun is completely blocked from view, ash is constantly falling, and it's just caked around pretty much everything. Sludge and grease and muck are just covering roads and trees and oceans and rivers. It's the complete death of nature. During the book, you get glimpses of what happened, and we know that it was probably some sort of disaster. Throughout the book, there are additional disasters that start happening, earthquakes and wildfires and ash and soot and dust that is covering the world. I think the smart money is probably on nuclear holocaust, but I don't think that's ever explicitly stated in the book. But anyway, I do think it's important to just describe the atmosphere and the environment and really hammer this in, because this is not just some simple, typical post-apocalyptic wasteland that you might see in a TV show or a book. This is really taken to the fullest degree. This is the shrinking down of the world to nothing, the total loss of meaning, and this is the light of the world going out, and what that would actually mean for everyday existence. When a world is this bleak, the stakes are cosmic. So we mentioned how there's no sun, and there's a constant stream of ash falling, and at night you get this unbearable cold that is deadly, obviously. During the day, it's often the worst weather, just freezing cold and rain. And of course, on top of that, periodically, you'll get these natural disasters, earthquakes, wildfires, storms, blizzards, and living in this, and in particular, what it's done to humanity has, again, put into question some of the most basic things that we all take for granted. Things like goodness and hope and love. I'm going to read a passage here from the first third of the book that describes the man and the boy on their journey, and it also hints at some of this loss of meaning that the devastation of this world has created. I like this passage because you get a feel for the book as far as the man and the boy being on this journey and some of the language of how they're moving around and constantly moving from place to place. You can also get a sense of the bleak language that McCarthy uses and sort of the short staccato moment-to-moment survival that is encapsulated in the way that McCarthy writes the book. And of course, you also get this sense of the total loss of meaning in this passage, which I want to try to convey. So Cormac McCarthy says, quote, "In the evening, they tramped out across a field trying to find a place where their fire would not be seen, dragging the cart behind them over the ground. So little of promise in that country. Tomorrow they would find something to eat. Night overtook them on a muddy road. They crossed into a field and plodded on toward a distant stand of trees, skylighted stark and black against the last of the visible world. By the time they got there, it was the dark of night. He held the boy's hand and kicked up limbs and brush and got a fire going. The wood was damp, but he shaved the dead bark off with his knife, and he stacked brush and sticks all about to dry in the heat. Then he spread the sheet of plastic on the ground and got the coats and blankets from the cart, and he took off their damp and muddy shoes, and they sat there in silence with their hands outheld to the flames. He tried to think of something to say, but he could not. He'd had this feeling before, beyond the numbness and the dull despair, the world shrinking down about a raw core of parsable entities. The names of things slowly following those things into oblivion. Colors, the names of birds, things to eat. Finally, the names of things one believed to be true, more fragile than he would have thought. How much was gone already? The sacred idiom shorn of its reference and so of its reality, drawing down like something trying to preserve heat, in time to wink out forever. End quote. Again, I like that passage. This is McCarthy describing existence, the world, the universe, shriveling up and dying. Later on in the book, McCarthy describes how the man will periodically just break down sobbing. He says, quote, "There were times when he sat watching the boy sleep that he would begin to sob uncontrollably, but it wasn't about death. He wasn't sure what it was about, but he thought it was about beauty or about goodness, things that he'd no longer any way to think about at all." End quote. This is a world so bleak and so hopeless and so dead that death isn't even the primary concern. In fact, there's multiple moments throughout the book where the man thinks that death might be a luxury. The real pain, the real horror of this is that something like goodness and hope is not even possible. It's barely even possible to think about it anymore. McCarthy describes the man as living on borrowed time in a borrowed world, looking out at it through borrowed eyes. He will often describe the man and the boy as farm animals sitting out in the rain. At one point, he says that this situation is the frailty of everything revealed at last. In another passage, McCarthy describes a firestorm that the man and the boy are traveling through. He says, quote, "Beyond a crossroads in that wilderness, they began to come upon the possessions of travelers abandoned in the road years ago. Boxes and bags, everything melted in black. Old plastic suitcases curled shapeless in the heat. Here and there the imprint of things wrested out of the tar by scavengers. A mile on, and they began to come upon the dead. Figures half mired in the blacktop, clutching themselves, mouths howling. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Take my hand, he said. I don't think you should see this. End quote. If you're thinking that maybe there will be some small group of humanity who band together to overcome the post-apocalyptic Holocaust and work together against the odds to maintain civilization, then you're wrong. Unlike most post-apocalyptic tales I've come across, this trope doesn't really get played out in the road. In this world, humanity has turned on itself. Almost every person the man and the boy come across in the road is dangerous and has to be viewed as a threat simply based on the situation. And oftentimes they do represent the worst of humanity and what humanity can be capable of. So hopefully you get the idea that this really is a special type of horror. And I think it's actually important for the story to kind of work that this gets established, that this is a true Holocaust of a wasteland that is ramped up to 11. Because it brings up a lot of questions about just what the man and the boy are really doing. They're clinging on to something, this idea of goodness and hope and human love, even though there's no reason at all in the world to continue holding on to these things, and those things in the outside world are effectively dead. You get these little glimpses of goodness and hope in the man and the boy, whether it's their conversations or their actions or their dreams and memories. In a beautiful passage, McCarthy says, quote, "In the nights, sometimes now he'd wake in the black and freezing waste, out of softly colored worlds of human love, the songs of birds, the sun." End quote. So the man can still remember these things. And one of the interesting things about the book is whether or not he wants to pass these things on to the son. The son is someone who really has grown up most of his life, at least most of his conscious life, in this horror of a wasteland. And it would actually be very difficult for the kid to even have a grasp of the concepts of some of these things. This is a kid who probably has never seen the sun. He doesn't understand what it's like to be in a relationship, or to have a meaningful friendship, or to have a quiet moment of solitude to appreciate the beauty of nature. Often the man worries that by telling him too much of this previous world, it will upset the kid somehow. The man does tell him stories, however, and oftentimes the stories are about goodness and justice and love, and it's clear that the boy appreciates these things. And because of the very fact that the environment, the atmosphere, the world around them is so disgusting and terrible, these little glimpses of love, these moments in dreams or memories, or really just the simple moments of ordinary life that the man and the boy are able to pause and enjoy their own company, take on this profound and meaningful significance. Cormac McCarthy describes the boy's first and only experience of Coca-Cola. Quote, "He slipped the boy's knapsack straps loose and set the pack on the floor behind him, and he put his thumbnail under the aluminum clip on the top of the can and opened it. He leaned his nose to the slight fizz coming from the can and then handed it to the boy. 'Go ahead,' he said. The boy took the can. 'It's bubbly,' he said. 'Go ahead.' He looked at his father and then tilted the can and drank. He sat there thinking about it. 'It's really good,' he said. 'Yes, it is.'" End quote. In another moment, the man finds a cistern of clean water, and McCarthy has this long passage describing how the man is drinking the water. And the simple taste of water is this just incredible moment for the man. It's exotic and it's beautiful, and in this world, it's totally unnatural. So whether it's sipping a can of Coke or sipping a glass of clean water. Again, because of the horrors of the world, it is these simple and rudimentary things that can bring people together and take on a whole new meaning. And of course, this concept extends to the audience reading the book, and it has this sort of double effect where, as the reader, we're being transported into this world and we're experiencing things, the horrors that the man and the boy are experiencing. And when they share a can of Coca-Cola, we begin to wonder about the things that we take for granted in our own lives, and maybe ponder that things don't have to be the way they are. They could be different, and they could be much worse. Earlier, I mentioned the stories that the man will tell the boy. McCarthy says, quote, "He banked the fire against the seam of rock where he'd built it, and he strung the tarp behind them to reflect the heat, and they sat warm in their refuge while he told the boy stories. Old stories of courage and justice as he remembered them, until the boy was asleep in his blankets, and then he stoked the fire and lay down warm and full and listened to the low thunder of the falls beyond them in that dark and threadbare wood." End quote. Here we come back to this theme of stories and what they mean, how they mean, given that they aren't real. And in this case, you wonder what types of stories that the man is telling the boy, the stories of courage and of justice. Oftentimes, these types of stories in our own time and in our own world are described as simple nonsense. A movie, a story, a child's book, a superhero movie. But in this bleak and horrific world that McCarthy has created, those stories matter. Those concepts of courage and justice being expressed through those things and through story is part of what keeps the man and the boy going. But in classic Cormac McCarthy fashion, the man can't go overboard with these stories of courage and justice. He wants to protect his son, and he wants to shield the son from seeing the horrors and the depravity of humanity at this point. And the man wants to expose his son to beauty and love, but sometimes the reality of staying alive in this environment means that they can't dwell on beauty and love too much. They often have to move on and continue along the road towards their destination. So finding this balance between shielding the kid and protecting him versus exposing him to what he's going to need to survive, the motivation and the purpose and the love that he's going to need, that's a difficult balance for the man to find throughout the book. A great example of this happens early on in their journey. They reach a waterfall, which has somehow managed to preserve some sort of appeal. It looks beautiful. The water is swimmable. The man and the boy have some great moments swimming and building a fire near the waterfall, enjoying some food. But they know because of this balance, they can't stay there long. If something is nice and pretty in this world, it won't be long before other people find it. And chances are other people are going to corrupt it. So in the next couple of episodes, we are going to look at the man and the boy's journey through this corruption, what it means, why there's no mother anymore, what evil looks like at the end of the world, possible religious and spiritual elements to this book, and what it means to carry the fire. All that and more coming up in the next few episodes.